There's a dangerous kind of control that doesn't look like control. There are no chains, no locked doors, no one standing over you telling you what to do. Instead, they make you choose what they wanted you to choose. They make you question yourself. They make you chase their approval. They make you afraid of losing them. And eventually, you start controlling yourself for them. That's the most sophisticated form of psychological influence. Because you don't even realize you're being controlled. You think you're making your own decisions. You think you're protecting the relationship. You think you're keeping the peace. You think you're being understanding. But sometimes, you're simply responding exactly the way someone learned you would respond. Think about the person who suddenly becomes cold whenever you disagree with them. You notice the change. Their messages become shorter. Their tone changes. They stop giving you attention. And what do? You start wondering what you did wrong. You replay the conversation. You examine your words. You send another message. You apologize. You explain yourself. And eventually, you give them what they wanted. Not because they asked directly, because they created an emotional environment where you felt compelled to give it. That's psychological control. And the terrifying part is that it can happen inside relationships, friendships, workplaces, families, almost anywhere human beings interact. The person doesn't need to say, "Do what I want." They simply learn. What makes you afraid? What makes you insecure? What makes you seek approval? What makes you panic? What makes you feel guilty? What makes you chase? Once someone understands those things, they have leverage. And if you don't understand your own psychological triggers, you may hand them the control yourself. So today, we're going to expose the mechanisms behind it. Not so you can manipulate other people, but so you can recognize the moment someone begins manipulating you. Because the most powerful defense against psychological control is awareness. And the first thing you need to understand is this. People rarely control you by force. They control you through consequences. Imagine someone who knows you hate conflict. They discover that whenever you disagree with them, they become angry. So you start avoiding disagreement. Not because they told you to, because you've learned what happens when you challenge them. They don't have to control your mouth. You control it for them. Or imagine someone who knows you are terrified of rejection. Whenever you set a boundary, they threaten to leave. Maybe we're just not compatible. Maybe you should find someone else. If that's how you feel, we're done. Suddenly, your boundary disappears. You become agreeable. You abandon what you wanted. And later, you tell yourself, "I just didn't want to lose them." That's exactly the problem. The fear of losing someone can become more powerful than your desire to respect yourself. And once someone discovers that, they don't need to physically control you. They simply need to threaten the thing you're afraid of losing. This is why emotional independence is so important. If someone's approval determines your confidence, they can control your confidence. If someone's attention determines your mood, they can control your mood. If someone's presence determines whether you feel valuable, they can control your self-worth. That's why the strongest men aren't necessarily the loudest men. They're the men who are difficult to move emotionally. Someone can insult them. They don't collapse. Someone can reject them. They don't beg. Someone can withdraw attention. They don't panic. Someone can disagree. They don't immediately abandon their position. This doesn't mean they don't feel emotion. They do. They simply don't allow emotion to become the steering wheel. And this is where most people fail. They think emotional control means becoming cold. It doesn't. It means feeling something without immediately obeying it. You're angry? Pause. You're afraid? Pause. You're jealous? Pause. You're desperate to send a message? Pause. That small gap between feeling and action is where your freedom lives. Because someone can only control your reaction if they can predict your reaction. And when your reaction becomes automatic, you become programmable. Think about a button. Press it. The machine responds. Someone insults you. You explode. Button. Someone ignores you. You chase. Button. Someone gives you attention. You become attached. Button. Someone threatens rejection. You surrender. Button. Now imagine what happens when you stop pressing the buttons. They insult you. You remain calm. They withdraw. You continue your life. They provoke you. You observe. They attempt to guilt you. You ask for evidence. They threaten to leave. You accept their decision. Suddenly, the old system stops working. And That is the beginning of psychological independence. But there's something even deeper, because some people aren't controlling you through obvious manipulation. They're controlling you through your need to be understood. This is one of the most underestimated forms of psychological weakness. You say something, they misunderstand you. So you explain. They misunderstand again. You explain more. They accuse you of something you didn't do. You defend yourself. They question your intentions. You give them evidence. They still don't believe you. So you explain again, and again, and again, until you're exhausted. Here's the uncomfortable truth. You don't have to convince someone who is committed to misunderstanding you. Read that again. You don't have to convince someone who is committed to misunderstanding you. Because at a certain point, the conversation isn't about understanding. It's about control. They keep you explaining because they know you'll keep trying to prove yourself. And while you're defending yourself, they're setting the frame. They're deciding what you're guilty of. They're deciding what evidence counts. They're deciding when the conversation ends. You've entered their courtroom and accepted their rules. The stronger response is often much simpler. I understand that's how you see it. That's it. No 10-minute explanation. No emotional essay. No desperate attempt to change their mind. Because your self-respect cannot depend on winning every argument. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is allow someone to have the wrong opinion about you. Let them misunderstand. Let them criticize. Let them judge. You know who you are. And if someone genuinely wants to understand, they'll ask questions. They'll listen. They'll consider your answer. But if someone only wants to accuse, no amount of explanation will satisfy them. That's why silence can be more powerful than argument. Not because silence magically dominates people, because silence protects your energy from pointless battles. And this brings us to another psychological mechanism, intermittent attention. This is when someone gives you attention, then removes it, gives you affection, then becomes distant, makes you feel important, then ignores you. Warm today, cold tomorrow. And that unpredictability can create a powerful emotional attachment. You start thinking about them constantly. What happened? Did I do something? Why were they so loving yesterday? Why are they distant today? You begin chasing the version of them that appeared during the good moments. That's the trap. You're no longer responding to the person as they consistently are. You're chasing the possibility of who they occasionally become. And that's why inconsistent attention can sometimes feel more addictive than consistent affection. Because your brain keeps waiting for the next reward, the next message, the next compliment, the next moment of closeness, the next sign that everything is okay again. And when it finally arrives, you feel relief, not necessarily happiness. Relief. And relief can become addictive. This is why some people stay trapped in unhealthy relationships for years. Not because every moment is terrible, because the good moments are just unpredictable enough to keep hope alive. And once you recognize that, you stop asking, how do I get them to give me attention again? You start asking, why am I accepting a relationship where basic respect feels like a reward? That question can change your life. Because healthy connection doesn't require you to constantly earn your position. You shouldn't have to perform emotional gymnastics just to receive basic kindness. And if someone repeatedly creates instability, you don't have to become better at surviving the instability. You can simply leave it. That's an important distinction. You don't need to become an expert at tolerating manipulation. You need to become better at recognizing when manipulation is happening. And this is exactly why the Dark Mind Protocol focuses on psychological awareness, emotional control, boundaries, and self-respect. The goal isn't to teach you how to dominate people. It's to make you much harder to dominate. Because once you understand your own triggers, other people have fewer buttons to press. If rejection doesn't destroy you, rejection becomes less useful as a weapon. If silence doesn't make you panic, silence loses its power. If criticism doesn't determine your identity, criticism becomes information rather than control. If you can walk away, threats of abandonment lose their leverage. That's real power. And we're only at the beginning. Because there are several psychological tactics people use without ever announcing what they're doing. And the next one is particularly dangerous because it can make you feel guilty for having completely reasonable boundaries. It's called guilt manipulation. And once you learn to recognize it, you'll start seeing it everywhere. Guilt is one of the most effective tools of psychological control because it attacks something most decent people naturally possess: the desire to be a good person. You don't want to hurt people. You don't want to disappoint them. You don't want to be selfish. You don't want to be the reason someone feels bad. And that sounds like a strength. It can be, but without boundaries, your empathy can become an opening that someone else uses against you. Imagine you finally decide to say no. Someone asks you for something. You don't have the time. You don't want to do it. So you calmly say, "I can't." Instead of accepting your answer, they respond, "Wow, I guess I know where I stand with you." Notice what just happened. They didn't ask you to reconsider. They didn't explain why they needed your help. They attacked your character. Suddenly, you're no longer thinking about whether you want to do the thing. You're thinking about whether you're a bad person for saying no. That's the psychological shift. The conversation moved from, "Will you do this?" to, "What kind of person are you?" And now you're defending your identity. Maybe you start explaining, "It's not that I don't care. I would normally help. I'm just really busy." And suddenly, your simple boundary has become a negotiation. That's exactly what you must learn to recognize. A healthy person can be disappointed by your boundary without trying to destroy your confidence for having one. They might say, "I understand. No problem." They may not like your decision, but they respect your right to make it. Manipulation sounds different. If you cared, you'd do it. "After everything I've done for you, you're becoming selfish. I guess people can't count on you anymore. I would never treat you like this." Those statements may sound emotional, but pay attention to what they're trying to accomplish. They're attempting to make the emotional cost of saying no greater than the cost of saying yes. And once that happens, you stop making decisions based on what you actually want. You start making decisions based on how much guilt you're willing to endure. That's not freedom. That's emotional conditioning. And the solution isn't becoming heartless. It's learning one of the most important sentences a man can know. "I understand you're disappointed, but my answer is still no." That's it. No 20-minute defense. No apology for existing. No desperate attempt to make them comfortable with your boundary. Because someone else's disappointment doesn't automatically mean you've done something wrong. That's a distinction many people never learn. You could disappoint someone and still be right. You can make someone angry and still have a valid boundary. You can refuse someone and still be a good person. You can walk away and still care about them. These things can coexist. And once you understand that, guilt becomes much less useful as a weapon against you. But there's another tactic that works alongside guilt: the silent punishment. You say something they don't like, and suddenly they stop talking to you. No explanation, no discussion, just coldness. Maybe they refuse to answer. Maybe they deliberately withdraw affection. Maybe they act as though you don't exist. And because you hate the tension, you eventually approach them. "Are you okay? Did I do something? Can we talk?" They've learned something. Silence makes you chase. So silence becomes a weapon. Again, the solution isn't to become equally childish. You don't need to punish them back. You don't need to ignore them for exactly 48 hours. You don't need to create a competition. Instead, you stop rewarding the behavior. If someone needs space, give them space. If they want to communicate, they can communicate. But you don't spend the next 12 hours trying to repair a conflict they refuse to discuss. This is one of the most important differences between emotional maturity and emotional dependence. Emotionally dependent people experience someone else's withdrawal as an emergency. Emotionally mature people experience it as information. That's a huge difference. Someone becomes distant. Information. Someone refuses to communicate. Information. Someone repeatedly uses silence to punish you. Information. You don't have to immediately solve every piece of information. Sometimes, you simply observe it. And observation is one of the most powerful skills you can develop. Because manipulation becomes much harder when you stop reacting long enough to see the pattern. Look at what happens when you're constantly reacting. They say something. You answer. They withdraw. You chase. They return. You forgive. They provoke. You defend. Everything happens at their speed. You're always responding. You're always one step behind. But when you slow down, the dynamic changes. You can ask, what exactly is happening here? What happened immediately before they changed behavior? What response are they trying to create? Does this happen repeatedly? What do they gain when I react? That final question is extremely powerful. What do they gain? If someone repeatedly criticizes you until you agree with them, what do they gain? If someone becomes cold until you apologize, what do they gain? If someone threatens to leave whenever you establish a boundary, what do they gain? If someone overwhelms you with affection and then disappears, what do they gain? Don't focus only on what they say. Study the pattern. Because words can be manipulated, patterns are harder to hide. And this is where psychological awareness becomes almost like a sixth sense. You begin noticing sequences. You notice that every time you become independent, someone suddenly becomes more affectionate. Every time you disagree, they become hostile. Every time you set a boundary, they become the victim. Every time you pull away, they suddenly promise everything will change. Then once you return, the behavior returns. That's not a single incident. That's a pattern. And patterns deserve more attention than promises. This is why powerful men don't rush to label everyone a narcissist, manipulator, or psychopath. They don't need a diagnosis. They need observation. They don't need to know someone's psychological label. They need to know whether the behavior is healthy enough to remain around. That's a much more useful question, because sometimes people manipulate without even consciously realizing they're doing it. They learned unhealthy patterns themselves. Maybe that's how conflict worked in their childhood. Maybe they learned that withdrawal gets attention. Maybe they learned that guilt gets compliance. Maybe they learned that anger makes people surrender. Understanding the reason doesn't mean accepting the behavior. You can understand someone and still establish distance. You can have empathy without becoming their emotional hostage. That is emotional control. And there is another psychological trap that catches intelligent people: over-explaining. You already saw this earlier, but here's why it's so dangerous. Every time you feel obligated to prove your intentions, you're accepting someone else's authority to judge your character. Think about that. Someone says, "You're selfish." You immediately respond, "I'm not selfish because..." Now you're defending yourself inside their frame. They say, "You don't care about me." You respond with 10 examples proving that you do. They say, "You're changing." You start explaining your entire life. And eventually, you become exhausted. Here's a better approach. Sometimes you simply say, "You're entitled to your opinion," or "I see it differently," or "That's not how I see the situation." And stop. You don't need to win every accusation. You don't need every person to understand you. You don't need unanimous approval. Because the moment you require everyone to see you correctly, everyone gains power over you. Someone can always misunderstand you. Someone can always dislike you. Someone can always criticize you. Someone can always create a story about you. You cannot control that, but you can control whether you participate in the courtroom. And sometimes, the most powerful move is to leave the courtroom entirely. This is also why silence can be strategic. Not silent treatment, not punishment. Silence as restraint. You hear something provocative, and you don't immediately answer. You allow yourself to think. You let the emotion pass. Then you decide whether a response is even necessary. Because not every attack deserves a response. Not every accusation deserves an explanation. Not every opinion deserves your attention. Not every person deserves access to your emotional energy. And once you understand that, you begin protecting something much more valuable than your reputation: your peace. Because people can manipulate you through attention just as easily as they can manipulate you through rejection. They can make you feel important, then make you feel invisible. They can praise you, then criticize you. They can pull you close, then push you away. And if your emotional state follows every movement, you become trapped on their emotional roller coaster. Get off, not by becoming cold, by refusing to let someone else's emotional instability become your emotional responsibility. And this brings us to one of the most subtle forms of control of all. They make you feel responsible for emotions they created. They're angry. You must fix it. They're disappointed. You must compensate. They're insecure. You must reassure them endlessly. They're jealous. You must prove your loyalty. They're upset. You must surrender your boundary. Eventually, their emotional state becomes your full-time job. And that's when you need to remember, You are responsible for how you treat people. You're not responsible for controlling every emotion they experience. That's their responsibility. And the same applies to you. Other people are not responsible for regulating every emotion you experience either. That's why emotional independence is so powerful. It allows two people to exist without one becoming responsible for the other's entire psychological stability. That's healthy connection. Not, you must make me feel okay, but I can feel uncomfortable and still remain responsible for myself. That's strength. And if you build that strength, the manipulator's favorite weapons begin losing their effectiveness. Guilt doesn't work as easily. Silence doesn't create panic. Rejection doesn't create desperation. Criticism doesn't destroy your identity. Withdrawal doesn't make you chase. And emotional chaos doesn't automatically become your problem. But there's one final mechanism we need to expose. And it's arguably the most dangerous because it can make you question your own memory, judgment, and perception. It's what happens when someone begins rewriting reality itself. And once you learn to recognize it, you'll understand why some conversations leave you feeling confused even when you know something was wrong. There's a form of psychological manipulation that doesn't simply try to change your behavior. It tries to change your perception of reality. And this is where manipulation becomes much more dangerous. Because if someone can convince you that your own memory is unreliable, that your feelings are irrational, that your boundaries are unreasonable, that events didn't happen the way you remember, then they don't need to control your decisions directly. They can control the information you're using to make those decisions. Imagine you confront someone about something they clearly said. You remember the conversation. You remember the words. You remember the tone. You bring it up, and they respond, "I never said that." You know they did. So you explain. They say, "You're remembering it wrong." You insist. They say, "You always exaggerate everything." Now you're confused. You start questioning yourself. Maybe I'm misunderstood. Maybe I'm being too sensitive. Maybe I remembered it incorrectly. And suddenly, the conversation is no longer about what happened. It's about whether you're capable of knowing what happened. That's an entirely different battlefield. This kind of manipulation is often associated with gaslighting. But you don't need to become obsessed with labels. You need to recognize the pattern. Healthy disagreement sounds like, "That's not how I remember it. I saw it differently. I understand why you interpreted it that way, but that's not what I intended." That's normal. Two people can remember an event differently. Manipulation becomes much more concerning when someone repeatedly denies obvious events, attacks your sanity for bringing them up, shifts the conversation away from their behavior, and makes you feel like you're losing your grip on reality. The objective isn't understanding. It's destabilization, because a confused person is easier to control. Think about that. When you're confident about what happened, you can make decisions. When you're constantly questioning yourself, you hesitate. You ask others for confirmation. You seek approval. You become dependent on the very person creating the confusion. And that creates a vicious cycle. They destabilize you. You seek reassurance. They become the authority, and then they define reality for you. That's why you need an internal reference point. You need principles. You need standards. You need the ability to step outside the emotional moment and ask, what do I actually know? Not, what do they say happened? Not, what would make them happy? Not, what do I need to believe so this relationship survives? What do I actually know? That's a powerful question. And sometimes the answer isn't enough to make a final judgment. That's okay. You don't need absolute certainty to establish distance. If someone repeatedly leaves you confused, anxious, and doubtful, you don't need to prove they're secretly manipulating you. You can simply recognize, this dynamic is unhealthy for me. That's enough. You don't need a courtroom verdict to protect yourself. And that's a principle I want you to remember throughout this entire video. You don't need to prove someone is a bad person before deciding they are bad for you. That's freedom. Because many people remain in destructive relationships trying to solve a mystery. Are they actually manipulating me? Are they a narcissist? Do they really love me? Why do they behave like this? They spend months, sometimes years, trying to decode another person's psychology. Meanwhile, their own life is falling apart. You don't need to become a detective. Observe the behavior. Observe the pattern. Observe how you feel around them. And most importantly, observe what happens when you establish a reasonable boundary. That's one of the best tests of character. A healthy person may disagree with your boundary, but they can respect your right to have one. An unhealthy dynamic often reacts differently. The moment you establish a boundary, the other person becomes the victim. So you don't love me anymore? You're becoming selfish. You're treating me like a stranger after everything I've done for you. And once again, you're pulled into defending yourself. But remember, a boundary isn't an attack. It's information. This is what I will participate in. This is what I won't. This is what happens if the behavior continues. That's all. You don't need permission. And you don't need to convince someone that your boundary is philosophically correct. They can dislike it. They can disagree. They can leave. That's their choice. And this is where emotional independence becomes real. Because boundaries mean very little if you're terrified of the consequences of enforcing them. Imagine telling someone, I won't accept being insulted. But every time they insult you, you stay. Eventually, your words become decoration. The real boundary isn't what you say, it's what you're willing to do. That's why powerful people don't spend all day announcing their standards. They demonstrate them, quietly, consistently, without drama. And this is exactly where the concept of self-respect becomes more important than dominance. You don't need to control another person. You need to control your own access. Who gets your time? Who gets your attention? Who gets your trust? Who gets another chance? Who gets to know your private thoughts? Who gets access to your emotional world? Those are decisions you control. And access should be earned through behavior, not demanded through guilt, not guaranteed because of history, not maintained because you're afraid of being alone. Think about how many people stay connected to someone simply because we've known each other for years. History isn't a lifetime contract. Someone can have been important to you and still become unhealthy for you. You can appreciate the past without sacrificing the future. That's another thing manipulators can exploit. They remind you of everything they've done for you. They create a psychological debt. After everything I've done, remember when I helped you? You wouldn't be where you are without me. Now you're expected to repay the debt indefinitely. But healthy relationships don't operate like permanent invoices. Kindness shouldn't become a weapon. Support shouldn't become ownership. Love shouldn't become leverage. If someone gives you something and later uses it to control you, that wasn't generosity. It was a transaction they never disclosed. And once you recognize that, you stop feeling obligated to surrender yourself because someone once did something good for you. Gratitude is healthy. Debt-based obedience is not. Now let's talk about another powerful mechanism, triangulation. This happens when someone introduces a third person into a conflict to create insecurity, competition, or pressure. Maybe they say, everyone agrees with me. Maybe, my ex never complained about this. Or, other people would be grateful to have me. Or, you know what she would do in your position? The purpose is often to make you compare yourself. Now you're not simply dealing with the original issue. You're competing against an imaginary standard. You start thinking, maybe I'm not good enough. Maybe I need to prove myself. Maybe I need to change. And once again, you are chasing approval. This is why secure people don't compete for basic respect. If someone tells you, someone else would treat me better, your response doesn't have to be, no, I'll do better. It can simply be, then you should be with them. That's not arrogance. That's acceptance. You don't compete for a position someone is threatening to withdraw. You allow them to make their choice. And if they choose to leave, you let reality answer the question. This is one of the most important psychological shifts in becoming difficult to manipulate. You stop trying to prevent every loss. Because fear of loss is one of the biggest sources of leverage another person can have over you. If you believe, I absolutely cannot lose this person, then they don't need to threaten you often. The possibility itself controls you. But when you develop the ability to say, I would prefer that you stay, but I will survive if you leave, something changes. The fear decreases. Your judgment becomes clearer. Your boundaries become stronger. And you can finally evaluate the relationship based on reality instead of desperation. That's why walking away is sometimes less about leaving someone and more about proving to yourself that you can. Not as a threat, as an internal capability. You don't need to announce, "I'll leave you." You simply know, if this becomes unacceptable, I can leave. That knowledge alone changes how you behave. And this brings us to perhaps the most important principle in the entire Dark Mind protocol. Never negotiate against yourself. Don't lower your standards before anyone even asks. Don't apologize before you've done anything wrong. Don't surrender your boundary because someone becomes uncomfortable. Don't explain yourself endlessly because someone refuses to understand. Don't chase someone because you're afraid they'll leave. And don't accept disrespect simply because you don't know what comes next. Because every time you abandon yourself to preserve a relationship, you teach yourself a dangerous lesson. Their presence is worth more than my self-respect. Repeat that enough times, and your confidence collapses. But reverse it. Every time you honor a reasonable boundary, you build evidence. You prove to yourself, I can handle discomfort. I can survive rejection. I can tolerate someone being disappointed. I don't need everyone to approve of me. I can walk away. That evidence becomes confidence. Real confidence isn't something you repeat in the mirror. It's something you accumulate through behavior. And once you've accumulated enough of it, people begin noticing something different about you. You don't react as quickly. You don't explain everything. You don't seek approval. You don't panic when someone becomes distant. You don't need to win every argument. You don't need to control every outcome. You observe. You decide. You move. And that's when manipulation becomes much harder. But there is still one final trap. It's the trap that catches people who have learned all of these concepts. Yet still secretly crave the approval of the person manipulating them. They know the tactics. They can identify the patterns. They can explain psychological control perfectly, but deep down, they still want the manipulator to choose them. And that is where everything collapses, because knowledge without emotional independence changes nothing. You can understand every manipulation tactic in existence and still be controlled by one simple desire. I need them to love me. And in the final part, we're going to deal with exactly that. How to break the deepest form of psychological control. The moment when the person no longer controls your behavior. Because they no longer control what you believe you need from T. The deepest form of psychological control isn't when someone controls what you do. It's when they control what you believe you need. Think about that carefully. If someone can make you believe you need their approval, they don't have to force you to do anything. You'll do it yourself. You'll change your behavior. You'll censor your opinions. You'll tolerate things you once said you'd never tolerate. You'll become more agreeable. You'll become more available. You'll constantly monitor their reactions, and you'll call it love. But sometimes, it's fear wearing the clothes of love. You aren't staying because the relationship is healthy. You're staying because the thought of losing it feels unbearable. You aren't apologizing because you've done something wrong. You're apologizing because you can't tolerate their disappointment. You aren't explaining yourself because communication is necessary. You're explaining yourself because you need them to believe you're a good person. You aren't accepting disrespect because you genuinely forgive it. You're accepting it because you're terrified that standing up for yourself will cost you the relationship. And this is where the cycle becomes self-reinforcing. The more you surrender, the more afraid you become of losing what you've surrendered to. Because now you have invested your dignity, your time, your identity, and your emotional stability into keeping the relationship alive. Walking away doesn't just mean losing them. It means confronting everything you've sacrificed. That's painful, so you stay, and the cycle continues. Breaking it requires something uncomfortable. You have to become willing to disappoint people, not because you want to hurt them, because you understand that their comfort cannot always be your priority. There will be moments when someone doesn't like your decision. There will be moments when someone calls you selfish. There will be moments when someone says you've changed. There will be moments when someone tells you that you're difficult. And sometimes, that's simply the price of having standards. You cannot build a strong identity while simultaneously requiring universal approval. Those two goals contradict each other. If everyone must approve of you, then everyone gets a vote on who you become. And the moment you realize that, you begin taking your identity back. You stop asking, what will they think? And start asking, what do I think? You stop asking, will they be angry? And start asking, is this consistent with my values? You stop asking, what can I do to make them stay? And start asking, is this relationship worthy of my continued investment? That shift sounds simple, but psychologically, it's enormous because you've moved from approval seeking to self-direction. And self-direction is one of the foundations of power, not power over people, power over yourself. This is why the most emotionally secure people can appear strangely calm during conflict. They're not calm because they don't care. They're calm because they know disagreement doesn't erase their identity. Someone can be angry with them, and they're still themselves. Someone can reject them, and they're still themselves. Someone can misunderstand them, and they're still themselves. Someone can leave, and they're still themselves. That's emotional independence, and it changes the way you enter every relationship. You don't walk in thinking, please choose me. You walk in thinking, let's see whether we're compatible. That's a completely different psychological position. You're no longer auditioning. You're evaluating. You're no longer trying to convince someone of your value. You're observing whether their behavior aligns with yours. You're no longer desperate to keep every connection. You're selective about the connections you maintain. And this is where the concept of quiet confidence becomes so important. Quiet confidence doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need to. The man who constantly tells everyone how powerful he is usually needs them to believe it. The man who actually knows who he is doesn't need to convince the room. He can speak less, observe more, leave arguments unfinished, allow criticism to exist, and continue moving. That's why restraint can be more powerful than aggression. Aggression says, you need to know how strongly I feel. Restraint says, I know how strongly I feel. I don't need to perform it. And that difference matters, because emotional reactions reveal information. When someone can provoke you instantly, they learn your triggers. When someone knows exactly what makes you panic, they gain leverage. So don't make your emotional state public property. You don't have to hide your feelings. You simply don't have to surrender them to everyone. This is one reason the Silent Strategist concept inside Dark Mind Protocol is so important. The principle isn't never speak. It's don't reveal more than necessary. You don't need to explain every plan. You don't need to announce every goal. You don't need to reveal every insecurity. You don't need to tell everyone what you're afraid of. You don't need to justify every decision. Information creates leverage, and not everyone deserves unlimited access to your internal world. That doesn't mean becoming secretive or paranoid. It means becoming selective. Trust should be earned gradually. Access should be earned through consistency. And vulnerability should be given to people who demonstrate that they can handle it responsibly. Because there's another mistake emotionally insecure people make. They reveal everything too quickly. Their fears, their insecurities, their entire history, their deepest wounds, their future plans. Then they become surprised when someone eventually uses that information against them. Not everyone will, but you should never assume everyone won't. Discernment is not paranoia. It's judgment. And judgment becomes sharper when you stop desperately needing people to like you. Because when you need approval, you ignore red flags. You rationalize contradictions. You make excuses. You see potential instead of behavior. You think, maybe they'll change. Maybe I'm misunderstood. Maybe I'm being too harsh. Maybe if I communicate better. And sometimes, you're not being patient. You're avoiding reality. Reality is often simpler than we make it. Watch what people consistently do. Not what they promise. Not what they say during emotional conversations. Not who they claim they are. Who are they when they're frustrated? Who are they when you say no? Who are they when they don't get what they want? Who are they when they have power? Those moments reveal far more than a carefully prepared conversation. And if you learn to watch those moments, you become much harder to fool. But here's where we need to be careful. The goal isn't to become suspicious of everyone. You don't want to walk through life thinking every person is manipulating you. That would simply create another form of psychological imprisonment. You would become controlled by your fear of being controlled. That's not freedom either. Real psychological strength is balanced. You trust, but you verify. You care, but you maintain boundaries. You communicate, but you don't over-explain. You forgive, but you remember patterns. You give chances, but not infinite chances. You love, but you don't surrender yourself. And perhaps most importantly, you remain capable of walking away. That capability changes everything. Because when you know you can leave, you stop negotiating from fear. Imagine being in a conversation with someone who says, "If you don't do what I want, I'm leaving." The dependent response is, "Wait, please don't. What do you want me to do?" The emotionally independent response is, "That's your decision." Not, "Fine, leave." Not, "I don't care." Not, "Go ahead." Just, "That's your decision." For words, no begging, no challenge, no drama. Because you're not trying to control them. You're simply refusing to let their threat control you. That's a profound difference. And sometimes, the other person will leave. Let them. It will hurt. Of course it will. Emotional independence doesn't mean pain disappears. It means pain doesn't automatically dictate your behavior. You can be heartbroken and still have standards. You can miss someone and still refuse to chase. You can love someone and still know that the relationship is unhealthy. You can grieve and still move forward. That's strength. And if you're at the point where you want to build that strength systematically, that's exactly what the Dark Mind Protocol is designed around. The complete bundle goes deeper into emotional control, psychological awareness, self-respect, power dynamics, boundaries, and strategic communication. It also includes Never Chase Again, the Silent Strategist, psychological warfare, the respect framework, and make them mentally obsessed with you. If you want to explore the complete system, the link is in the description and pinned comment. But don't buy anything simply because I told you to. Understand the principle first. Your power doesn't come from owning a framework. It comes from applying it. Because the strongest psychological system in the world is useless if you continue abandoning yourself every time someone threatens to leave. So start small. The next time someone tries to make you feel guilty for saying no, don't immediately defend yourself. Pause. The next time someone withdraws attention to make you chase, don't chase. Pause. The next time someone criticizes you, don't automatically explain. Pause. The next time you feel desperate to prove your value, ask yourself, who am I trying to convince? And perhaps most importantly, ask, what am I afraid will happen if I stop? That question exposes the root. Maybe you're afraid they'll leave. Maybe they'll become angry. Maybe they'll stop loving you. Maybe they'll find someone else. Maybe they'll think you're selfish. Maybe they'll discover you're not as valuable as you hoped. And that's where you need to confront something. You cannot build your life around preventing every possible rejection, because rejection is part of life. Loss is part of life. Disappointment is part of life. People change. People leave. Relationships end. Friendships disappear. Plans fail. And if your entire sense of security depends on preventing those things, you'll spend your entire life trying to control what cannot be controlled. The alternative is much more powerful. Become the kind of person who knows, whatever happens, I will handle it. That's confidence. Not, nothing bad will ever happen, but something bad may happen, and I'll still be okay. That mindset destroys a tremendous amount of psychological leverage, because fear works best when you believe you cannot survive the consequence. Once you prove to yourself that you can, the consequence loses its power. And this is the final stage. You stop asking, how do I stop them from controlling me? And start living in a way where control becomes unnecessary. You don't need to monitor every tactic. You don't need to decode every sentence. You don't need to analyze every message. You don't need to wonder whether someone is secretly manipulating you. You simply maintain your standards. You observe behavior. You communicate clearly. And if the dynamic becomes unhealthy, you leave. That's it. No psychological warfare. No revenge. No manipulation. No elaborate strategy. Just self-respect. And perhaps that's the greatest lesson of all. The ultimate form of psychological freedom isn't controlling other people. It's reaching a point where they don't need to be controlled, because you control yourself, your emotions, your attention, your decisions, your boundaries, your access, your reactions, your direction. And once you have that, someone can praise you. You remain grounded. Someone can criticize you. You remain grounded. Someone can approach you. You remain grounded. Someone can walk away. You remain grounded. Because your center isn't located inside another person. It's inside you. And that's when you become difficult to manipulate. Not because you're mysterious. Not because you're ruthless. Not because you're playing games. But because you no longer need another person's approval to remain loyal to yourself. That's the real power. And once you understand that, nobody can control you the way they used to. There's a moment when psychological independence becomes real. It isn't when you learn another manipulation tactic. It isn't when you memorize another Machiavellian principle. It isn't when you discover the perfect response to an insult. It happens when you realize something much simpler. You don't have to participate. Someone wants an argument? You don't have to argue. Someone wants to provoke you? You don't have to react. Someone wants you to chase. You don't have to chase. Someone wants you to prove your worth? You don't have to audition. Someone wants to make you feel guilty? You don't have to accept the guilt. Someone threatens to leave? You don't have to beg them to stay. This is where your entire psychological position changes. Because manipulation depends on participation. It requires you to enter the game. And once you understand that, you become much harder to move. Think about a chessboard. A player can make a brilliant move, but the move only matters because the other player continues playing. If you recognize that the game is designed against you, you don't necessarily need to become better at playing it. Sometimes, you simply leave the board. That's the difference between strategic intelligence and endless reaction. Most people spend their lives trying to become better at responding to every situation. The stronger approach is learning which situations don't deserve a response at all. That doesn't mean becoming passive. It means becoming selective. Your attention is a resource. Your emotional energy is a resource. Your time is a resource. Your trust is a resource. And what you give your resources to shapes your life. So stop treating attention like something that must be given equally to everyone. It shouldn't be. Someone who consistently respects you deserves more access than someone who consistently destabilizes you. Someone who keeps their word deserves more trust than someone who repeatedly breaks it. Someone who communicates honestly deserves more vulnerability than someone who uses your vulnerability as ammunition. This isn't cruelty, it's discernment. And discernment is one of the greatest forms of self-protection. Because the goal isn't to become suspicious. The goal is to become observant. There's a difference. Suspicion says, everyone is trying to manipulate me. Observation says, I'll watch what they consistently do. Suspicion creates anxiety. Observation creates clarity. And clarity makes manipulation much harder. This is why you should stop obsessing over whether someone has a hidden psychological tactic. Instead, look at the outcome. How do you feel after interacting with them? Do you feel respected? Do you feel safe expressing disagreement? Can you say no without being punished? Can you make independent decisions? Can you maintain friendships and interests outside the relationship? Can you be yourself without constantly monitoring their reaction? Can you make mistakes without fearing emotional retaliation? These questions tell you more than 100 psychological labels. And here's something many people don't realize. A healthy relationship doesn't require you to become smaller. It doesn't require you to constantly monitor yourself. It doesn't require you to abandon your ambitions. It doesn't require you to cut off everyone else. It doesn't require you to prove loyalty every day. It doesn't require you to live in fear of triggering someone. Healthy connection gives you room to remain yourself. That's why one of the clearest tests of any relationship is simple. Can you still be yourself inside it? If the answer is no, something is wrong. Maybe the other person is manipulative. Maybe you're insecure. Maybe both of you have developed unhealthy patterns. The label isn't the priority. The pattern is. And patterns can be changed, or they can be left, but they cannot be ignored forever. Now think about your own behavior. Because psychological strength isn't only about recognizing what others do. It's about recognizing where you are vulnerable. Maybe you crave validation. Maybe you fear abandonment. Maybe you're addicted to being needed. Maybe conflict makes you uncomfortable. Maybe you overexplain. Maybe you apologize too quickly. Maybe you become defensive when criticized. Maybe you struggle to say no. Maybe you constantly seek reassurance. These aren't reasons to hate yourself. They're areas where you need awareness. Because every weakness you refuse to examine becomes a potential lever someone else can pull. So instead of hiding your weaknesses, study them. Ask, what behavior from another person creates the strongest emotional reaction in me? That question is revealing. If rejection destroys you, study your relationship with rejection. If criticism makes you defensive, study your relationship with criticism. If being ignored makes you panic, study your relationship with attention. If someone being angry makes you surrender your boundaries, study your relationship with conflict. You don't defeat psychological vulnerabilities by pretending they don't exist. You defeat them by becoming familiar with them. Once you know your trigger, you can prepare for it, and preparation creates choice. Imagine someone criticizes you tomorrow. Your old reaction might be immediate. You defend yourself. Your heart rate rises. You start explaining. You try to prove them wrong. But now you recognize the pattern. You feel the reaction, and instead of obeying it, you pause. Maybe you say, I understand that's your perspective. Maybe you say nothing. Maybe you ask, what specifically are you referring to? Maybe you simply walk away. The important thing isn't the exact sentence. The important thing is that you chose your response. That's emotional control. And the same applies to rejection. Someone stops responding. Old you. Check your phone. Send another message. Ask what happened. Wonder what you did wrong. Maybe send another. Then another. New you. Notice the silence. Feel the discomfort. Continue your day. If they want to communicate, they know where to find you. That's a completely different psychological state. You haven't become indifferent. You become stable. And stability is attractive because it signals something important. This person has an internal center. They aren't waiting for the world to tell them how to feel. They're capable of feeling without being controlled by every emotion. That's what quiet confidence looks like. And ironically, the less desperately you try to appear powerful, the more powerful you often become. You don't need to dominate every conversation. You don't need to have the final word. You don't need to make everyone respect you. You don't need to win every interaction. You simply need to respect yourself enough that you don't betray your values to win. Approval. That is the difference between image and identity. Image asks, how do I look? Identity asks, who am I when nobody is watching? And the second question is the one that matters. Because you can fool an audience. You can create an image online. You can appear confident. You can wear the suit. You can speak with certainty. You can quote Machiavelli. You can talk about power. But if one person's rejection can destroy your confidence, you aren't psychologically free yet. And that's okay, because freedom is built. It's trained. Every time you choose your principles over your fear, you strengthen it. Every time you tolerate temporary discomfort instead of abandoning yourself, you strengthen it. Every time you say no without excessive guilt, you strengthen it. Every time you walk away from disrespect instead of trying to convince someone to treat you better, you strengthen it. And eventually, your behavior starts changing your identity. You become the person who trusts himself. That's the real goal. Not becoming someone who never feels fear. Becoming someone who can feel fear and still make the right decision. That's courage. And that's where the dark mind protocol ultimately leads. Not toward becoming a manipulator. Not toward becoming emotionally numb. Not toward becoming cruel. Toward becoming difficult to manipulate because you understand yourself. You know your weaknesses. You know your standards. You know your values. You know your boundaries. You know what you're willing to tolerate. And you know what you're willing to walk away from. That's enough. Because when you know what you stand for, you don't need everyone else to tell you where to stand. And if you want to go deeper into that system, the complete Dark Mind Protocol is available through the link in the description and pinned comment. The bundle includes the main protocol and all 5 bonuses. Make them mentally obsessed with you. The Silent Strategist, Never Chase Again, Psychological Warfare, and the Respect Framework. The purpose isn't to give you tricks to control people. It's to help you understand the psychological dynamics around you while strengthening your own emotional control, boundaries, and self-respect. Because the best defense against manipulation isn't learning how to manipulate better. It's becoming someone who doesn't desperately need what the manipulator is offering. Attention, approval, validation, affection, acceptance. Once you stop depending on those things from a specific person, their ability to control you decreases dramatically. And that brings us back to the beginning. They can still criticize you. They can still reject you. They can still ignore you. They can still walk away. They can still misunderstand you. But something has changed. You no longer hand them the meaning. Their rejection doesn't mean you're worthless. Their anger doesn't mean you're wrong. Their silence doesn't mean you have to chase. Their criticism doesn't define your identity. Their departure doesn't mean your life is over. You interpret, you decide, you move. And that's why the most powerful man in the room isn't necessarily the man controlling everyone else. Sometimes, he's the man sitting quietly in the corner, watching everything, feeling everything, and refusing to surrender control of himself. Because that's the one form of control that matters most. Self-control. So the next time someone tries to provoke you, don't immediately respond. Observe. The next time someone tries to guilt you, don't immediately apologize. Observe. The next time someone withdraws attention, don't chase. Observe. The next time someone tries to make you question yourself, return to the facts. The next time someone threatens to leave, remember that you're allowed to let people make their own decisions. And the next time you feel that desperate urge to prove your worth, stop, take a breath, and ask yourself, why am I trying to convince someone who has already decided what they want to believe? You may discover that the answer isn't about them at all. It's about you. Your fear, your need for approval, your fear of being alone, your fear of rejection, your fear that you're not enough. And once you face that fear, it loses its grip, because the person who no longer needs to be chosen cannot easily be controlled by the threat of rejection. The person who can tolerate silence cannot easily be controlled through withdrawal. The person who can accept criticism cannot easily be controlled through shame. The person who can say no cannot easily be controlled through guilt. The person who can walk away cannot easily be controlled through abandonment. And the person who knows who he is doesn't need someone else to define him. That's the transformation. Not becoming untouchable, becoming internally anchored. And when you become anchored, you stop being dragged around by every emotional storm. You can love without losing yourself. You can trust without becoming blind. You can forgive without forgetting. You can communicate without over-explaining. You can be vulnerable without surrendering your judgment. You can walk away without revenge. And you can remain calm when someone tries to pull you into chaos. That's power. Quiet power. The kind that doesn't need an audience. The kind that doesn't need to announce itself. The kind that exists even when nobody is watching. And if there's one idea I want you to remember from this entire video, let it be this: people can only control what you are afraid to lose. So build a life you don't want to escape from. Build your own purpose. Build your standards. Build your discipline. Build your relationships. Build your competence. Build your identity. Build yourself. Because the stronger your foundation becomes, the less leverage anyone else has over you. And eventually, you stop asking, how do I stop them from controlling me? Because the answer becomes obvious. You don't. You control yourself. And that is enough. If this video gave you a different perspective on psychological control, subscribe to Dark Mind Protocol. We're going deeper into emotional control, human behavior, manipulation, power dynamics, self-respect, and the psychology of becoming harder to influence. And remember, the strongest person isn't the one who controls everyone else. It's the one who cannot be controlled against his own values. Stay calm, observe more, react less, and never surrender yourself just to keep someone else.